In the context of escalating trade tensions with the United States, national Indigenous leaders in Canada have found themselves at the forefront of a unique diplomatic initiative. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has reached out to these leaders, asking them to engage in lobbying efforts with their American counterparts. This request comes as a strategic move to counter the tariff threats posed by President-elect Donald Trump, which could have significant repercussions for the Canadian economy. The request was made during a pivotal meeting on a Wednesday morning, where Trudeau gathered leaders from the national organizations representing Inuit, Métis, and First Nations communities. This meeting marked the first direct engagement between Trudeau and Indigenous leaders since he announced his intention to resign, making the discussions particularly significant. The meeting lasted approximately 1 hour and took place at the Prime Minister's office, just before Trudeau's scheduled discussions with provincial premiers regarding the looming economic threat from the United States. The Indigenous leaders expressed their desire to be included in the subsequent First Minister's meeting, highlighting their commitment to being part of the national dialogue. However, they were informed that they would not be participating, raising concerns about their exclusion from critical conversations that could affect their communities. The involvement of Indigenous leaders in this lobbying effort underscores the importance of their voices in national and international discussions. Historically, Indigenous communities have faced numerous challenges, particularly in relation to economic policies that impact their rights and resources. By engaging with U.S. counterparts, these leaders hope to not only defend Canadian interests, but also advocate for the recognition of Indigenous rights and perspectives within broader trade discussions. The potential tariffs proposed by Trump are not just a matter of economic policy. They carry profound implications for the livelihoods of many Canadians. The threat of a blanket tariff could affect a wide range of goods, leading to increased prices for consumers and destabilizing industries reliant on trade with the U.S. For Indigenous communities that depend on trade for their economic sustainability, the repercussions could be particularly severe. The request for Indigenous leaders to lobby against U.S. tariffs reflects the intricate web of trade relations between Canada and the United States. As the two countries are each other's largest trading partners, any disruption in this relationship can have far-reaching consequences. The Canadian government is keenly aware that Indigenous communities possess unique insights and connections that could be instrumental in navigating this complex landscape. Despite the proactive stance taken by Trudeau and Indigenous leaders, significant challenges remain. The political landscape in the U.S. is unpredictable, especially with a new administration that has already signaled a willingness to adopt aggressive trade measures. Moreover, the exclusion of Indigenous leaders from key meetings raises questions about the inclusivity of the decision-making process and the extent to which Indigenous voices are truly valued in national discussions. In a significant development within Canada's political landscape, national Indigenous leaders are stepping into the spotlight as Prime Minister Justin Trudeau seeks their assistance in addressing the looming threat of tariffs posed by President-elect Donald Trump. This request marks a pivotal moment for Indigenous representation in Canadian governance and highlights the intricate relationships between Indigenous communities, government officials, and international economic pressures. The meeting between Trudeau and Indigenous leaders, which took place on a Wednesday morning, was the first official gathering since the Prime Minister announced his intention to resign. This context adds a layer of urgency and importance to the discussions, as both parties navigate a rapidly changing political environment. The Prime Minister emphasized the need for a united front against the potential economic repercussions that Trump's tariff threats could bring to Canada, particularly focusing on the impact on Indigenous communities. During the hour-long discussion, Trudeau urged the Indigenous leaders to engage with their counterparts in the United States. This request underscores the recognition of Indigenous leaders as key stakeholders not only within Canadian politics, but also in the broader context of international trade and relations. The Prime Minister's call to action reflects a growing acknowledgement of the unique position Indigenous communities hold in economic discussions, especially given their historical ties to both Canadian governance and the land. Although the Indigenous leaders expressed their desire to participate in the upcoming First Minister's meeting, where provincial and territorial leaders would gather to strategize on economic threats, they felt sidelined as they were excluded from these critical discussions. This exclusion raises important questions about representation and equity in decision-making processes that affect Indigenous rights and interests. The leaders articulated their concerns to Trudeau, highlighting the necessity of including Indigenous perspectives in discussions that could have far-reaching consequences for their communities. The demand for inclusion reflects a broader trend toward recognizing the rights and voices of Indigenous peoples in Canada, particularly in matters that intersect with economic and environmental issues. The backdrop of these discussions is the complex relationship between Canada and the United States, both of which share deep economic ties. The threat of tariffs, particularly a blanket 25% tariff on Canadian goods, poses a significant risk to various sectors of the economy, including industries that are vital to Indigenous communities, such as natural resources, fisheries, and agriculture. The economic implications of these tariffs could exacerbate existing challenges faced by Indigenous communities, many of which are already grappling with issues of poverty and economic development. Engaging Indigenous leaders in the lobbying efforts against these tariffs not only serves to bolster Canada's negotiating position, but also addresses the economic vulnerabilities that Indigenous communities may face in the event of a trade war. By positioning Indigenous leaders as advocates in this scenario, the Canadian government is taking a step toward fostering a more inclusive approach to governance. This collaboration could pave the way for a more equitable consideration of Indigenous rights in future trade agreements and negotiations. The leaders' involvement in lobbying efforts could also strengthen their communities' economic interests, ensuring that their voices are heard in discussions that impact their livelihoods. The participation of Indigenous leaders in these conversations is vital for ensuring that the unique challenges faced by their communities are acknowledged and addressed. It also reflects a shift in how Indigenous rights are perceived within the context of national and international policies, recognizing that these rights are integral to the fabric of Canadian society. As the situation unfolds, the relationship between the Canadian government and Indigenous communities could evolve, leading to a more collaborative approach in addressing economic and political challenges. The potential for a trade war necessitates a united response, and the inclusion of Indigenous voices in this dialogue may serve to strengthen Canada's position on the international stage. Moreover, the dynamics of this situation may influence future negotiations and policies, emphasizing the importance of recognizing and incorporating Indigenous perspectives in all facets of governance. As Canada navigates these complex issues, the role of Indigenous leaders will likely continue to grow, shaping the narrative around trade, rights, and representation. In conclusion, the meeting between Prime Minister Trudeau and Indigenous leaders signifies a crucial moment in the ongoing dialogue about Indigenous rights, representation, and economic participation in Canada. By actively seeking the involvement of these leaders in lobbying efforts against U.S. tariffs, the Canadian government is not only acknowledging their importance as stakeholders, but is also taking steps toward a more inclusive and equitable approach to governance. The exclusion of Indigenous leaders from the First Minister's meeting highlights ongoing challenges in achieving true representation and equity within the political landscape. However, the willingness of Indigenous leaders to engage in discussions around trade and economic policy suggests a commitment to advocating for their communities and ensuring that their voices are heard in the face of external pressures. As Canada confronts potential economic challenges, the collaboration between Indigenous leaders and the government will be essential in shaping a collective response that honors the rights and interests of all Canadians.